We need growth in this economy. Both Labour and the Tories admit that, but there are two very, very different routes. And so this week, after the autumn statement, I want to look at the economy and in particular the question of growth, because on that, almost everything else in domestic politics now depends, including the result of the election. And I want to start by reading out perhaps the most famous sentiment or sentence from the most famous book that John Maynard Keynes ever wrote, The General Theory, in 1936, and talking about the way the economy actually works, how growth really happens inside the economy. He kind of rather dismissed an overly mathematical view of it all. What he said was this. He said, "Our decisions to do something positive can only be taken as a result of animal spirits, of a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and not as the outcome of a weighted average of quantitative benefits multiplied by quantitative probabilities." And this notion of animal spirits, there's the sentiment underlying the economy, is something I'd like to look at today, because if you take the political headlines after the autumn statement, they are frankly pretty drearily predictable. The Tories have created spending traps in the years ahead. They haven't properly funded unprotected departments and public services going forward into the mid-2020s, and that is designed to force Labour to admit that they will raise taxes and then affect the debate going into the election. That is one area. And in response to that, you have Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, really saying very little at all about taxation or spending.
I want taxes on working people to be lower.
She has her mouth effectively zipped the entire time because she's not going to fall into those traps. And I think for an awful lot of voters, particularly still uncommitted voters, this is really drearily predictable. It feels like cynical politics as usual. Not much is going on. You've got two parties playing games with each other and not really focusing on economic growth, the big issue. And what I want to argue this week is that that is wrong. There are two different philosophies at work here, and they both really matter. Now, there's an awful lot on which Rachel Reeves and the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, actually agree. They agree about the scourge of inflation and the incredible importance of pushing it down and down and down. They agree that the public finances are extraordinarily tight. They agree that Britain is spending far too much just repaying debt interest at the moment. That's the second largest, as it were, department in the entire economy. They are equally worried about worklessness, the number of people simply not going to work after the pandemic, a big problem for Britain. And above all, they agree about the importance of growth. And this is absolutely right. Without better growth in the economy, if the Tories won the election, and presumably going through their 19th leadership fight of some kind, they would be presiding over a shattered, destroyed public realm and a country really with no confidence in itself at all. And if Labour win the election and there is no growth, then 2 years into a Starmer government, the electorate will have lost faith in him and Rachel Reeves and the Labour Party. This is absolutely central. Now, as Keynes pointed out, in the real economy, we grow or we fail to grow, not on the basis of very detailed decisions from government ministers or what's said in the House of Commons, but on the basis of millions upon millions of individual decisions based on animal spirits, how we fundamentally feel, how optimistic we are. So, for instance, when the company profits come into a small company, are they used to buy a rather nice country home or to buy important new equipment and to train up new workers? Do people remortgage to take the risk of starting a new business, or do they flinch from that? How hard do we all really work? These are the things that create growth or the failure of growth. And in that context, it is important to say that the political mood really matters. If people think the country is going somewhere, there's a direction of travel they can believe in, they feel optimistic about the country, then growth is more likely. And you see that in terms of international investment. It pours in when international investors around the world look at Britain and think, actually, this is a country in relatively good hands with clear management and a clear plan. And if they doubt that, the money doesn't come in, the investment doesn't come in, and the entire economy starts to slide towards stagnation. So thinking about whether these animal spirits have been dampened down or inflamed over the past 13, 14 years, it's not very hard to know the answer. After the really dreary, tough years of Theresa May trying to make Brexit work in the House of Commons and then failing, after the extraordinary behaviour of the Johnson government, after the Truss explosion, not surprisingly, the animal spirits were dampened. There was no sense of national direction or national morale, simply a slithering zigzag of policies. The money didn't come in. Now, we're in a slightly different place now because under Sunak and Hunt, we have returned to classic conservative orthodoxy. And there is a story about that to tell to international investors and to voters here. And that's what Rishi Sunak has been doing. So let's turn to Monday, the 27th of November, Hampton Court Palace. And Rishi Sunak hosts a major investment conference for all those companies pouring money into the UK at the moment.
The Global Investment Summit is Britain's welcome to the business world, attended by over 200 of the world's leading CEOs and investors. My singular focus is driving growth and creating jobs across the UK.
And he is able to announce a big figure, £29.5 billion of investment, which he says is a huge tribute, not just to the companies concerned, but to Britain, what he calls thousands of jobs across the UK in our most innovative sectors, including tech, life sciences, renewables, housing and infrastructure. So good news for Britain. But that very morning at Ernst & Young's headquarters, just a few miles to the east by London Bridge, the Labour Party, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are hosting their own breakfast for very similar groups of companies. I'm talking about Toyota, I'm talking about Honda, Barclays Bank, EDF and many more. There are all the top honchos and they're there to talk to Labour, even before they go down the river to talk to the Tories. Because business is just like the rest of us. They look around, they can read the polls and they ask themselves, OK, how much time, how much effort am I really going to sink into making friends with Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt? Aren't they going to be out in a year's time? Should I not be talking to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves? And so what we see here, in a sense, is we see power, political power inside government and opposition power saying we're on the way, doing a kind of beauty parade in front of wealth. And what is going to happen next is a genuine choice between two different philosophies. The Conservative philosophy is that you hold down public spending, you accept deterioration in the public realm, you accept the National Health Service is not going to be all that everybody wants. You accept that local authorities up and down the country are going to struggle, and some of them are going to go bust. And you do all of that because if you've got a tight control of the public finances, you've got a tight control of inflation, and eventually the market will sort things out. The money will just bubble back and all will be well. And then on the Labour side, you have a party that does believe in the state, in the active state, which is looking to Joe Biden's America and the Inflation Reduction Act there and thinking, no, the government, the state can intervene in the market. There can be an industrial strategy. We are going to have a very expensive year-by-year investment in the green revolution. And by convincing the world that that is what we do and that's where we're going, we will get the money flowing in and we will raise those animal spirits all around the country who will look around and say, well, there is now a plan, there is now a direction forward, and those animal spirits will start to bubble back. Now, in all of this, you can see, I'm going to return now to, as it were, the dreary day-to-day politics. The Conservatives are focusing very heavily on the £28 billion investment in a green revolution, including Great British Energy. And all of those things first announced by Keir Starmer at a party conference 2 years ago.
I'm so proud to launch our Green Prosperity Plan, a plan that will turn the UK into a green growth superpower.
And is championed ever since by Ed Miliband, in particular, the Shadow Environment Secretary. And they are focusing, Labour are going to borrow £28 billion year by year by year, and if they are not going to reverse our tax cuts, they're not going to be able to pay for it, is the Tory narrative.
We have not increased borrowing by £28 billion a year. That would have pushed inflation up just when we need to bring it down.
Therefore, honestly, voters, Labour are going to raise your taxes, and they want to fight a kind of Labour's tax bombshell, Labour double whammy tax shock campaign running into the election. And that is the trap that Rachel Reeves is trying to avoid, not surprisingly. So let's just talk about that. When the Green Industrial Revolution strategy was first unveiled in September 2021, it was quite clear that this 28 billion included money the current government is already spending on things like connecting up the grid, on preparing for onshore wind farms or whatever it might be. And since that time, the government has spent, depending on how you calculate it, somewhere between £8 and £10 billion on these sorts of areas. So it isn't £28 billion, it's £18 to £20 billion, point one. Point two, Rachel Reeves has also been very clear that the money doesn't start immediately. You have to prepare the ground, and it comes in bit by bit by bit. So the big investments would only happen probably about halfway through a Labour administration, maybe a bit later than that. And her belief is that Labour's security, a big victory, and a sense to international business that Labour is going to be there for 5, probably 10 years' time, and there is a clear strategy for that period. You already have growth coming up. The numbers start to look better, and you are able to fund public services and to fund this without huge new borrowing. That is the hope. Those are the crossed fingers. And I think that is the Labour sense of how they are going to revive Keynes's animal spirits. But I also want to say that, personally, I am still highly sceptical as to whether the numbers will eventually add up. The public realm we talk about here is so shattered. There are so many schools in such a bad way. There are so many demands on local authorities which they aren't able to fulfil. The NHS needs so much proper investment. And not just in kit and equipment, that's very, very important because AI can improve diagnostics and turn things around in the NHS, but also, frankly, in doctors' salaries and nurses' salaries and all of that. All of those things are so important. And also, I think defence, we don't talk about defence, but I really fear what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. I think Russia is starting to win in that war. And I think our defence budget is going to have to go up in response to that. Eventually, Labour is going to have to look again at the whole taxation system in this country. And I feel that Britain is taxing income, work, hard work, too much, and accumulated wealth too little. And I know that's very offensive to a lot of people because they think I'm talking about their house. And if you're living in the south of England, I am. But nonetheless, my generation, the boomers, have had it so good. Through most of our lives, we've got our pension funds, we've had investments in stock markets and all the rest. We have accumulated a bit of wealth. We don't like talking about it because we're a bit embarrassed, but we have. And one day, Labour is going to have to start to tax wealth, accumulated wealth, a bit more. I think it might take the form of higher capital gains taxes or something like that. But I would predict that. Rachel Reeves will say, absolutely not, Andrew, you're talking out of your backside. We're not going to do it. She has to say that now, but I think it'll happen. And the second thing is, if we are really, really interested in growth, if we think growth is the biggest thing, we have to look again at Brexit. We have to look again at the frictions and the trade barriers, not between really big companies, they can afford to get round them, but between the small and medium-sized companies that are the backbone of British business and are trying to export to the EU. And because of the huge amount of paperwork and the changing regulations are giving up. Week by week, month by month, we are losing growth, we are losing trade with the EU, and we just cannot go on. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the EU, certainly in its current form, and the EU itself is changing very fast and probably doesn't want us back. But I do think that after one, perhaps even 2 terms of a Labour government, we will be back in the single market or something quite close to that. And we should be clear, that means rule-taking. It means not being part of the political core of the EU, because that would require another referendum, but taking their rules, their regulations. I think there's no problem with that. I think ultimately we are the same kind of society fundamentally as the Germans and the French and the Dutch, and we can work by the same kind of rules in return for greater growth. So those are 2 very controversial things to say: higher taxes on wealth and ultimately a return to the single market. And that's me, Andrew Marr, talking. It's not the Labour Party talking, but I'm giving you my best guess of what will happen several years into a Labour government. So those are the hard choices facing Labour. If we go back to the events of the last couple of weeks, the paradox for the Conservatives is that to attract big business, to attract the investment they need for the economy to grow, they have to have the confidence that they are going to be in power. And that confidence isn't really there. And because the confidence isn't there, they're not going to attract the huge amounts of money they need to attract. It goes round and round in circles in a downward direction. And I suppose you talk about the autumn statement, we think about the autumn. In this case, the animal spirits, the fire, the flame. Well, you cannot summon fire from mud. If you'd like to stay up to date and you'd like to see the latest explainers, field reports, feature stories and special discussion episodes, then please, folks, subscribe to our channel today.
Brought to you by Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Experienced wealth managers who go above and beyond to guide and support you. Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow.